he sent back the answer. I love this. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jew will arise from another place. Look at the faith that Mordecai had. All right? He's saying, if you don't step up and do this, the Jews won't be annihilated. You know why? Because they're God's chosen people at that time. They were God's chosen people. They couldn't be annihilated or killed off. Because why? Because God says, no, there will always be. My promises will never be revoked, ever. And I will never allow all of it. Now, He allowed a lot of them to be killed at times in rebellion. All those people that went across the Red Sea and got to the Promised Land and said, no, we can't go in. All those people died off in the wilderness, all of them. That's a whole, except for their children that were younger, survived and went in later. But God says, there will always be a remnant of mine. And Mordecai shows great faith. I mean, because he sees this is going to happen. This has been set in place. It's been sealed with a stone. And he apparently lived and worked some throughout the kingdom because they knew him. He was able to stop the king from being murdered because he overheard a plot against the king. So he must have been in around it. But so he knew that, this was set in stone. This was happening. And but you see the faith that he says. He says, you won't escape. Don't be silly. But if you remain silent, time, relief, and deliverance for the Jew will arise from another place. It's going to come from somewhere. But you and your father's family will perish. So I don't know if he had a revelation from God in that area to know that there's going to be revelation, but you're not going to escape if you don't do that. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this, right? So there where you get. He says, listen, who knows, right? You were dragged off from us, from your family, with all these women, out of what we would say chance, right? Or people of the day would say, what's the chances of her, a Jew, getting in there? No one knows she's a Jew. She gets in and gets picked out of almost 400 women to be the king's wife. And Haman, I mean, if Ezra doesn't get in there, Mordecai's still not going to bow down to Haman. And that edict's going to be placed that they're going to be wiped out. But God brought Esther in to be at that moment, in that right in time. Why? For His people. For His remnant and His people. So you see God's hand on bringing Esther in for a time that was coming where Haman was going to try and slay all of their people. So you see, like I said, God's name. What's interesting in this book, God's name's never mentioned. You never see God's names mentioned in this book, but you see God working the puzzle piece. Kind of like today, I've never seen God, right? I can't say I've ever seen Him, but I can say that I believe in Him. I know He's real. He's more real than anything I've ever experienced or anything like that. Just because I haven't sat down with Christ, hadn't broke bread with Him in a physical way. Right? But we believe God's working things around us. We believe that God is moving and is within every fiber there's something going on. And that's faith that the Haman extolled, that there will come a deliverance. And if you don't step up and do something, the deliverance is still going to come. But who knows? Maybe God put you there for this reason. And for application, like for us today, when we see the faith that Esther has in that, same thing for us. Who knows what's going to go on? But maybe God sets you there. God's will is going to come to fruition. There's no way of getting out of God's will. He set it in place and it's going to come. But at the same time, I say, how do you know that God hadn't brought you to right where you are so you can share His love for Him? Share Him around those people you're around. And how do you know God didn't bring you to this moment for a certain thing? And I think as Christians, it's good for us to step back Say, why did God bring me here? And we may not exactly know, but we can step back and say, why did God bring me here? And how do I honor God with this time? And how do I honor God with the people that are around me? And not going back under the law and saying, I got to do this, I got to do that. No, it's not that. It's saying, God, allow me to help me to see why you brought me here and lead me to do what your loving, pleasing will is, Father. And that's one of the takeaways from this story. You'll see, it says at the end of that, let me read that verse again, 14. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jew will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. What a statement. That is, you'll see from this middle part in this book right here, everything's going to flip. And it all hung on this right here. And I pray that I can be like Esther. That I can say, if I perish, I perish. Now, I know I would never deny Christ. But every day there's times that I could be stronger. And that I could be more of a witness to Him. And be more loving to those around me. Now, I know God's in control. That God's working and moving in me to get His will out. But if I'm honest with myself, I can say there's always more I could do for the Lord.
And she is doing God's will. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so are we. But like what Paul says, I don't run this race as if there's no reward. I don't run this race. I run this race to win. I'm not just running this race. I'm not just out here jogging. I'm running it to win. And that's what I want to be able to say at the end of my life, that I went as hard as I could for God. I didn't leave anything back. And that's not been the case at times. So that's my prayer. God, I want to be like Esther and say, if I perish, no, I don't want to let anything stop me from sharing and being who God has called me to be. And in my flesh, I'm incapable of being all that God's called me to be. But through the Spirit, I can do it. So I'm totally dependent on Christ. I'm totally dependent on Christ to change me, my will, and my wants to line up perfectly with Him. I'm totally dependent on Christ. I can't conjure that up. I can't do it. I have to call on God and really rely on Him and deny the flesh and just go to Him and say, Father, please move me today. I want to be right there with you. And that may seem like a nutty thing. That may seem way out there, but it's not, because there's no hope in the flesh. The flesh, you can mask it and try to do right, but anything that comes from faith is the Holy Spirit. Because it says the only way you can please God is through faith. And we can't have faith apart from the Spirit. The faith is a gift from God. So it's not something we can conjure up. So we have to go and pray. Sometimes it takes getting down on your knees and saying, God, please, I want to be more like you. I want to be like you. I want to love like the way you do. I want to be gentle like how you are. I want to be kind like how you are. And I want to be bold like you are and strong like your Son is. And God, I will need that. I want that. And you got to realize that doesn't come from yourself. That comes from the Spirit. The moment you try to make it come from yourself is the moment you'll fall so short and you'll feel so weak and so worthless, because you'll try and you won't make it. You'll try and you won't do it. So when you let go of that and you say, God, I'm totally trusting in your spirit, and I'm not going to focus on the rest, but God, I'm calling on you to help me, Lord. And you live that way. You run this race, and you run it by faith, and you run it to win. That's what we're called to, and sometimes it's hard, and sometimes God calls you to things you don't want to do. But we should be able to say, if I perish, I perish. Like the pastor in Canada, he was thrown in prison recently because he wouldn't shut the church doors because of COVID. And it's that kind of idea. If I go to jail, I go to jail. If they think I'm weird, they think I'm weird. If it's contrary to my flesh, if I want to revile and be mean and say something I shouldn't, well, I'm not going to say it. If I look weak because I'm loving, I'm going to look weak. Go ahead, Rick.
Did everybody hear what the folks said?
Right, about homosexuality.
About same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
Okay, that's kind of what you're saying is that he's coming out and he's saying, hey, we can't bless this,
Right, yeah.
In a sense, he's saying
He took a stand.
if I perish, I perish. Because
Yeah.
he's taking a stand.
Yes, and he had a lot of pressure.
I mean, at least it is,
Yes, Papa?
Can't you imagine what all he went through up to this period of time of coming out confessing that?
Yeah.
Man, he had to go through misery. See,
Yeah.
God's wrath come down on him.
Yeah.
He was a miserable person, so he come out with it. See?
Right.
You talking about the Pope?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, right. I think condemnation got on him so strong, I think that he just finally had to go on out and quit trying.
I'm proud of him for doing that because he had a lot of pressure on him to go the other way. I mean, it won't be long and a Pope will do that. Just there's so much pressure and you just seen it slide off. But
it came back up the hill.
yeah,
And
right.
he did that.
Yeah.
All that ground he lost,
Yeah.
he's making it up.
Yes. So we have to be strong and stand in our convictions, and even if it looks crazy. And that's my prayer, God. I just pray for me, because if I look myself in the mirror, I say, wow, I come short in these areas. But God can help me. I know God's big enough to help me. So why not confront it and ask God for what you need? For me,
Sometimes we get weak and we get so indifferent that we don't think that God's listening. We don't think that why he doing something about this.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, something like this happens. You go, hey, he's been in trouble all the time.
Right.
He's just whatever reason why he wanted to go as long as he did. That's what was supposed to happen. But
Right.
hey, it's coming out.
Yes, absolutely. So let's look. It's verse 17. It says, so Mordecai went away and carried all of Esther's instructions. So Esther said, hey, have everybody fast and pray. So it was serious. So serious that these people would deny food and say, we're going to go without eating for 3 days and drinking, which they probably had water, but just no like wine and other things like that. So you see it hit these people so hard, and you could imagine it would, right? If we get an edict, say President Biden says all the Christians can be slaughtered, right? Which won't happen, at least for a while, long time. But we would take that serious. I mean, and how do you respond to that? Do you fight back? No. They could have said, Lord, here we go. We need to attack. Now, if God gave them orders, hey, you can, then they should. But they went to prayer and fasting. They said, we are totally going to focus on God and go to Him. And you just see Mordecai, man. He brought up Esther the right way, and he went to God. He goes to God. And I love that. Chapter 5, it says, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, so after a fast, and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his gold scepter. So it took a lot of weight off her shoulders. That was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Thank you. So that was the ritual, and so you'd come up and touch it. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." So if she was really wicked, she could have said, "Well, hey, I'll take half the kingdom."
Yeah, maybe a bit more.
Right, yeah. So you see his love for Esther there, because he said, "I'll give you half the kingdom." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman," so Haman's the one that's done this evil deed of the annihilation, "come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once." The king said, "so that he may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet. So Esther's thrown him this banquet Esther had prepared as they were drinking wine. And the king asked Esther, "Now, what is your petition?" So he knows there's something more than a banquet. What's going on? "It will be given to you, and what your request, even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." So he's saying, what's going on? Why are you doing this? Esther replied, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." So she's really buttering him up, right? She's saying, "Okay, come back tomorrow. We're going to have another one of these banquets with his awesome food and his great wine. And then I'll tell you." So Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. So Haman, the one that's against Mordecai, but when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So he didn't kill him, so he went home. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about the vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the nobles and officials. So it's just pretty funny. You get your friends together just to boast. And that's not all, Haman added. "I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate." So all this just doesn't even help. His wife, Zeresh, and all his friends said to him, listen to how wicked these are, "Have a pole set up, reaching to the heights of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself." This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. So you just talk about wicked, man. Hey, it's like, Mackenzie, I tell somebody done something mean to me at work, and you say, "Hey, I got an idea for you. Ask your boss to get a noose hung up and see if they'll just hang them for it, and then, man, you'll have a great day." It's like, whoa, that's pretty wicked. And they're just like, "Yeah, it's a good idea, man. That's going to be great. Let's just kill him." And, man, that'll make the banquet feel so much better knowing that he's hung on a pole 50 feet, however high up. So, all right, so that's where we're at. Haman's going to be killed, or Mordecai is basically a dead man if this happens, and there's this big edict out that will just wipe out the Jews, right? So on paper, if we're looking at it, if it's in the newspaper, this is what's going on. So this is where a big change happens, and you see God here on the move here. It says, "That night the king could not sleep. He ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him." Which is kind of funny because he's like, "I can't sleep, so let's read about myself and how cool I am." It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway. So Mordecai, Esther's uncle, exposed these guys who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. So we read that earlier in the story. He told Esther, "Hey, they're going to kill the king," and Esther told the king. And it was written down in the book. And verse 3 says, "What honor and recognition had Mordecai received for this?" The king added, Nothing had been done for him, his attendant answered. The king said, "Who is in the court?" So nothing's happened. Who's in the court? Now Haman just had entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai. So he's reading about Mordecai and what he'd done to save him. Haman's on his way to talk to the king to ask if Mordecai can be impaled on a massive pole. Verse 5 says, his attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for a man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Yeah, who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor. Let him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" And the king says, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and just do as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you recommended." So Haman's walking in there to have Mordecai killed. He comes up to the king, and the king's like, "Hey man, what should I do for someone I dearly love and delight in?" And Haman's like, "Oh, he's thinking about me." Right? And then he says, "Do this, do this, do that. Throw the robe on him. Let him prance around on your horse and let it all be known that he's just an awesome person." And Haman's thinking, "Oh, it's going to be fun." Telling the king, "Yeah, let him do that." And then the king says, "We'll do that for Mordecai." And Mordecai was the one that he was coming in to talk to the king about to have killed, have hung on a pole. So you see a massive, drastic reversal. All because that night he couldn't sleep. So who kept him up that night? It was God, of course. God allowed him to just roll around in the bed. And then God allowed him to choose the one book that had Mordecai's story in. And that's not chance. That's almost the same chance that the world blew up and everything come into being without a God, right? There's zero chance that this had anything to do with chance. This was God working His magic there, if you want to call it that. And so, in verse 11 it says, so Haman got the robe, and he was so mad. He got the robe and the horse, and he was just, he robed Mordecai. What Mordecai think? And led him on horseback through the city streets, and Haman had to proclaim before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." After Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief, and told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of a Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet either Esther had prepared. Now, I think that they said that maybe because they realized that maybe their God's real, right? Because they say, he is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. Reading that, I thought, well, they were going to say, well, he's a Jew, and you got that eunuch, and he's going to kill him. But I feel like for them to say he's of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him, it's probably because they're like, oh, maybe these stories about these Jews are real. Maybe these stories about them being brought out and this and that out of the Red Sea and given this land and all these stories, maybe this is real because you had a pole made up, it was sure as could be, and you end up prancing this guy around, claiming how good he is and how much the king loves him. So that's a God reversal, just irony. And you see God has a sense of humor in this, right? In this story, it's like, wow. And He's given us this amazing story to read. You had something, Dad?
Oh, no, I can hear you say this. This is not going very well for you right now.
Yeah.
Table's getting ready to turn.
He's like, man. And so the king and Haman, how much time we got? Okay, we got a few minutes. So the king and Haman went to the Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And that had to throw him off. What do you mean? And spare my people. This is my request. And you know, he's listening intently here. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. She's showing great respect. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Who is he, the man who had dared to do such things? So he didn't realize he was a Jew yet. Esther said, an adversary and an enemy, the vile Haman. And Haman's sitting right there, eating good and drinking good. And he's like, what did this come from? Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. So he really loved her. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Then the king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? So he thinks he's trying to get her. But really, he's begging at her. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So they threw a bag on his head. Then Harbon, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, a pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. So the same thing. The king said, impale him on it. So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. So the same pole that was built for Mordecai, right? Haman's biggest enemy, Mordecai, was then used on Haman.
See, they wasn't doing crucifix back then, but they was talking about how this was kind of rung into that, where if you read in detail what it is, it's a sharp pointed
it's gruesome, man.
pole like this, and what they do is they hang you up and by your legs, pull you down through your rectum, and it comes all the way out and comes through, and you live for a little bit. They just pull you, like people just get by and just go, just pull you right down on it like this. Feet down in the middle, coming out, and it goes all the way up through.
Yeah. And
live for a little bit. So
and after
gallows.
At times in Rome, they were doing that to Christians after Christ's return, and you get into the letters aspect. Rome was blaming, there was a big fire, and Rome was blaming it on the Christians. Really, it was the king of Rome who started it. But they were taking Christians and piling them on poles, covering them tar, and having them be the lights for the streets. They lighten them, and they were the lights for the streets. So you see the persecution the early church faced to step out and say, we believe, was of immense. Not only did the Jews hate it and say this is evil, but then the even Roman government hated it. But yeah, so you see the irony, right? That these people are following God, they're trusting in God, and Haman is living in the world, doing no faith, zero faith at all, and living as if a faithless person would live. And the whole tables turn over in one night. Mm-hmm. You know, one night the whole tables turn. So, you know, it may look like we're losing or we're doing this or we're doing that, but really God has us and He's in control. And He says in the letters that He will work all things good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose.
God can
Boom, one night.
show justice or do justice.
Swiftly. And David talks about that a lot in Psalms. Swiftly come like that. And these people, like me, before I knew the Lord, it could have been in one night I could have died and been there and been judged. But God, just as swiftly as He brought salvation to me, can bring judgment on the earth. So that's why this world, you know, we need to be ready and live in a way that God sees everything. God knows everything. And and live in a faithful way to Him. And but you just I just love the irony in the story. It just totally turns. And that's going to do it for tonight. But we got to a really good part there. And this story has given me great hope through the weeks that I've been studying it, because to realize that's our God. The same God that's Esther's God and Mordecai's God is our God. And He's working a little differently now because we're not under the law, but it's still the same God. And He still loves me just like He loves Esther and He loves Mordecai. And He's still in control of all things. So I can say, okay, God, I believe You can do big things and real things. Just help my unbelief, you know. All right, let's pray. Yeah, go ahead.